Well, welcome everybody. This is a different turn of events than what we usually do. Many of you probably assumed that Otto Hawker was just a channel that was going to be dedicated to the Rhodesian Bush War, but that's not entirely the case. And even though Peter Thistle's a great mind, a great man of our movement, and I enjoy having him on here, from time to time we will be having other people on here as well to talk about different moments in history and things of that nature. Um, So without further ado, I would like to bring aptly named William Walker to the stand to introduce himself and what he's here to talk about today.
Well, good evening, Otto. Yeah, what? It's funny. What I'm going to talk about is exactly what I guess you could say I'm very familiar with. Obviously, so yeah, the Knights of the Golden Circle itself, and filibustering. These are topics in American history and the world at large that a lot of people don't really talk about these days. It's very niche and it's a very small chapter in our history. However, it's very fascinating. And given the fact that I'm very intimately connected to the Golden Circle, it's something that I've focused on most of my life. It's a period of American history that just really sucked me into it. And so it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be on your show this evening to talk about it.
Well, we're glad to have you, and I hope the viewers are glad to have you as well on here. So I guess to start with, do you think we could talk about the origins of? Well, first off, tell us about what the Knights of the Golden Circle is, the Golden Circle itself, and then we can go with the origins of filibustering and more or less what I'm going to call American expeditions into foreign countries.
Yeah, so, well, I guess happily we could start with what is the Golden Circle. So the Golden Circle was a name given to an area known as the Spanish West Indies and Central America. And of course, Spanish West Indies, we're talking about Cuba, we're talking about what we know today as the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and of course, Mexico, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Colombia. That was roughly the area known as the Golden Circle. And it was a very agriculturally rich and productive area. Hence, one of the reasons why it was of such great interest. There was a lot of commerce and trade there as well. A lot of hubs for that going taking place there. And well, the the actual interest in the Golden Circle starts very early on in American history. Right after the United States is freed of British control, there was already an interest in these areas because of their proximity to what is then the United States, and because of their economy, because of the fact that they're very fertile lands and also strategic as well. So the Golden Circle essentially was seen as a very desirable piece of geography for the economic and strategic benefits that they provided. And of course, to this very day, they are important, and we'll get to that later on. But now, as far as the Knights of the Golden Circle themselves go, these were a group of men who sort of came together from across the United States, not necessarily just the South, although predominantly they were all mostly Southern planners and businessmen, mostly Southern businessmen and planners who came together, but also Northerners as well, Northern Democrats who, after the Mexican American War, after the acquisition of the Pacific territories and so forth, they thought, well, we went that far. Why not continue south? Why not take the rest for the United
You
States as
know,
well?
I would like to throw a caveat in that a lot of us in the modern world we don't realize is if we think of ourselves as, I would say, think of the modern world as being a place where sure you can move up in society, sure you can change your profession, you can change your job, you can work in a completely different field than your ancestors worked in. But I would say in the most part, everything we do with our lives is very rigid and structured in regards to where we live and things of that nature. But back then, back in the past, we need to understand that the world was a lot more wild of a place. It was a lot more open of a place. And if you wanted to do something, pretty much if you had two legs and two arms and a group of people that could help you do it, you could get it done. And what I'm implying is that if you wanted to go, let's say, move from Virginia to Kentucky, you just get up and walk. A lot, we look at American men, European men in general going and I would say invading places. I mean, after Jamestown, and stuff, you could see where they were launching expeditions in the Shenandoah, and of course, right before the Revolution, we have land surveying parties going into the Ohio River Valley. We have Daniel Boone going into Kentucky. So it's in the almost the Anglo man to he doesn't just sit down and settle where he's at and stay there. I mean, we do, the majority of us do, but there's a few of us in our society who wonder what's on the next valley over. You'll have some like Daniel Boone, who's born in Pennsylvania. Basically, he's known for settling Kentucky, but if I'm right, he dies in Indiana or Iowa. That's where he ended up. And for the first part of America's birth after the American Revolution, there are tons of people that are living this life. They're born in one place, they move to another place, or move multiple places, and they die somewhere else. And so what we're seeing is this, general continuation of moving. And, we also with the South, it didn't help that the environment of the South situated that people could live this lifestyle and get away with it. What I mean by this is, for example, you could be a herder and you could spend your time herding your herd of cows or pigs, whatever, um, throughout the years through different states, and you would get by. And a lot of people lived this, lifestyle, this very nomadic lifestyle. And, with America's, kind of entrepreneurial spirit, that doesn't, help with that. And it kind of fostered sort of this, innate nature for a lot of, probably high testosterone men, ambitious men to go and move out and seek things. As Germanic people were known for that, whether it's the Saxons settling England or, the Viking invasions or the Teutonic order establishing, outposts in, Eastern Europe. That's a common feature of us. And I think that's probably a metaphysical background for filibusters, but you can continue on with what you're wanting to say.
Yeah, absolutely. It was basically a continuation of that tradition, and it was essentially a manifestation of the neo-American identity. We've come this far. We just defeated one of the greatest empires on the planet, and now we're surrounded by other empires. Why stop here? We can go so much further, and this is what these men had in mind. People like Daniel Boone, obviously people even higher than that, people like Thomas Jefferson. They all had their eyes on greater frontiers, and it was for good reason at that time. At that time, we were in the process of establishing an American republic with very, very ill-defined boundaries, and we see this expand. And so back to the Knights of the Golden Circle. It's funny you mentioned Indiana and Ohio, because the man who actually founds the Knights of the Golden Circle, George Bickley was his name. He actually was from Ohio, and he founded it in Cincinnati on July 4th, 1854. And what the Knights of the Golden Circle was basically a conglomeration of like-minded individuals from the North and the South, and they got together to essentially wrest control of Latin America and make it as to where they could essentially bring these countries into the United States and make them states. Essentially, that was the plan. And a lot of this was actually sanctioned by the federal government, by federal officials, most notably by, at the time of this was during roughly, this was right before Franklin Pierce's administration, but during the Pierce administration, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, he was all for it. Franklin Pierce himself was tacitly for it as well. Of course, you had the Whigs, who would later become the Republican Party. They were against it for different reasons, for sectional reasons mostly, because their economy and all pretty much clashed with what these individuals wanted, their economic interest and so forth, as well as political. And so the Knights of the Golden Circle really doesn't do a whole lot after the 1850s, but from the 1854 to roughly 1858, they're extremely active. They're agitating for further expansion. They are connected to the Pierce administration. They're connected to, later on, to the Buchanan administration. And they are working with people like Pierre Soleil, who was one of the authors of what's called the Austin Manifesto, which, funny enough, President Buchanan was involved with as well, which was essentially a document stating that, yeah, you know what, we need to go down there and take these countries for the benefit of the United States. And so that was essentially what the Knights of the Golden Circle was. Now, later on in the Civil War, the Knights of the Golden Circle formed the nucleus of the Confederate Army, because not only was the Knights of the Golden Circle a political organization, they had three different tiers. If I'm not mistaken, they had three different tiers, and these tiers were broken down into degrees. And the highest degree was obviously the political and financial degree. And then the second degree was sort of the more like the club, members who would mingle and donate. And then, of course, you had the third degree, which were the military members, the men who would actually drill and train and prepare for combat, essentially, and lead these expeditions. And these men, who would never, ever invade Latin America, they would later on end up serving in the ranks of the Confederacy, including George Bickley himself. He would be a doctor in the Confederate Army of Tennessee until he was captured in 1853.
Do you think you could I know the past basic information for some things can be kind of scarce to find, and you're talking about that they had a basically on the ground paramilitary force. Hearing that description reminds me a lot of pre-Civil War England. In pre-Civil War England, you had what were called the armed or trained bands, and essentially the idea is that instead of having a standing military, let's say like the Holy Roman Empire, which had a lot of Landsknecht mercenaries at the ready. And then they had the different baronies and duchies and states and electorates that could provide troops rather quickly for the army. England had this system almost of a every town, every shire, every county. If I'm not trying to be exact, I'm trying to kind of get the idea in the viewers' heads, but every little place had more or less let's say every town has 100 men, a company of troops that are under the command of a local gentry, a local knight. And the idea is that, let's say you have 100 men in 100 little towns, and they gather to the big town where the mayor is at, or basically what I'm trying to get at is that these armed bands were organized on a very small scale level and would have local gentry over them. And when a war happened, they would all gather in a bigger area. So you might have, a group of guys from a bunch of small towns go to a big town when a war breaks out. They meet there, and then they might actually meet with like a government official who then takes them to a government official that's been assigned with the military. A lot of this stuff sounds kind of almost similar, and I wonder if that comes from our Anglo-Saxon institution of like the feared, the militia, more or less being the main soldiery for most of our history. Men bringing their own equipment. Would you say that the Knights of the Golden Circle, their paramilitary force, if you can answer that, if it would be almost on a similar level, that you might have some men on a county level who report to like a lawyer who serves as their captain, who then reports to a colonel or something who's a big big wig like a state representative or senator who report, so and so on. Would you say it's kind of like that?
Actually, it was very much like that. So going further into the structure, they had in each area where the Knights of the Golden Circle were active, which is mostly the Deep South and what what we know today as the Midwestern states of Ohio and Indiana, and of course the Upper South and Kentucky. They had what were called castles, and in these castles, you had that exact structure. And of course, this is a time where Southern nationalism is really in vogue. This is a time when Southerners were beginning to identify with the Cavalier culture. With they were obsessed with Ivanhoe, right? So
Hmm.
that was essentially their entire mindset. Was we're basically Cavaliers. We are coming together as a militia to conquer these foreign lands for the great glory of the United States, for the glory of Anglo-Saxon society and civilization. And so now, we're going to form these castles. We're going to have this sacred brotherhood of Anglo-Saxon warriors. And they did report to local officials who were involved, and they did have their own weapons, and they would come together and drill. And a lot of these men were Freemasons, so they had some Masonic they had some Masonic rituals involved in there as well. And so they combined all of this to make sort of a secret fraternal organization with a paramilitary branch centered around that whole chivalric idea of knighthood, of being a cavalier, being a gentleman soldier, and just being a warrior for your civilization. So that would be an accurate description, absolutely.
It's kind of funny because the little bit I know of this time period too, especially in the South, is that they're doing all this on their own time when they already participate in a system that has these things in place. What I mean by that is that um, I don't know if you know this, but during the South in that period, and for even during under British rule, every county had a militia. Um, every county had a militia. Um, every man was expected to be a part of that militia. Um, they would run things called beats, where every man was basically assigned a mile they would patrol. And I'm kind of maybe getting some of this stuff wrong, but the idea is that there was already a rigid pseudo paramilitary structure in place. And the easiest way to see that is when the Civil War breaks out. How are all the men recruited? The men are coming in with their county militias. Their county militias are registering with the states to serve, and that's what most of the people were that fought the Civil War in the beginning of the war were these state militia people that were organized on a county level. Um, do you know like this is maybe kind of minute details that don't matter, but it always interests me. Do you know anything about like the weapons and equipment and uniforms maybe these paramilitary groups were using?
Well, yeah, it was basically a real hodgepodge of weapons. So you had Sharps rifles. They were the most common, especially in the 1850s. Of course, you had the the 1841 uh, muskets
Oh,
as
the
well.
Mississippi's.
The M1841 U.S. Army muskets. You also had cutlass swords. You had revolvers of all sorts that were brand new technology at the time. Obviously, the Colt 51 revolver was very big, the Navy revolver. So yeah, that was basically the sort of weaponry you would see, as well as locally made arms of all sorts.
I imagine you would also have a lot of probably older stuff like Kentucky rifles, um, black powder firearms, whether they're cap lock or flintlock,
Yeah,
just
you had that.
shotguns, just whatever they could bring.
Exactly. It was, you had a hodgepodge of advanced weaponry, and then, of course, flintlocks. You still had, the shotguns as well. Shotguns are actually very big in use. As a matter of fact, most Western Confederate soldiers at the beginning of the war were armed with shotguns, and for
We
whatever
know
good that was.
somebody said that they always talk about that the Winchester rifle won the West, but it was really the double barrel shotgun because
Yeah,
every household had them. I challenge you. If you have any connection to your family, go look back and see what firearms passed down the line. It's never usually rifles. It's usually shotguns. There's reasons for that. I don't want to get into those reasons because I could go on all day about the degradation of big game in America and the having to hunt small game for hunting purposes and home defense weapons, cheap home defense shotgun. Um, so those were very popular in back in that age. But do you want to talk about maybe like some of William Walker's involvement with the Knights of the Golden Circle, or maybe his if he was involved? I'm not for sure if he was involved or not, but more or less his story and how that relates to the Knights of the Golden Circle, and then maybe the outbreak of the Civil War and what they were doing.
yeah. So William Walker, my hero, the gray-eyed men of destiny, right? I mean, so the gray-eyed man of destiny, he knew about the Knights of the Golden Circle. He was loosely involved with them, but he was really doing his own thing. And so William Walker, he was doing his own thing, and he saw what was going on. He was very much in favor of the activities being carried out by these individuals. So he gets involved, and this is an individual from this time period where you're seeing the United States just grow up and expand, and of course he wants to join in this. He's born in Nashville, Tennessee. He's from the volunteer state, so he wants to take part in what's going on. So what does he do? In 1853, before he launches a successful invasion of Nicaragua, he actually goes into Mexico, into what's known as Baja California, and creates the Republic of Sonora. Now, that republic only lasts for a few months because of the fact that he was low on men, he was low on ammunition, just a complete logistical disaster. So that doesn't last very long. However, he's there long enough and he does well enough. William Walker does well enough that he actually catches the attention of many wealthy Southerners, and they say, well, maybe this person is onto something, and they fund his expedition in 1854 to Nicaragua. But now, here's why Nicaragua is different from Mexico, different from a lot of other failed filibustering operations. Nicaragua was undergoing a civil war at the time. And I'm not really going to get into too much of the details, but there was a big civil war in Nicaragua between something known as the Legitimist Party. And, of course, there was the Democratic Party of that country at that time, known as the Liberal Party. And so these two forces of natives were duking it out. And so William Walker got together and formed his military force. He got the funding, and they were able to successfully enter Nicaragua, establish some form of order and government, and was able to establish his republic. And not only was he able to establish his republic, he actually received, unlike any other, well, I can't say that, but unlike most filibusters, he actually received recognition by U.S. President Franklin Pierce. He was one of the few filibusters to actually have his republic recognized as a legitimate government. So that was what William Walker was able to accomplish in his time in Nicaragua. Whereas, George Bickley and the Knights of the Golden Circle, something that nobody understands is they never launched an expedition for several reasons. One was because by the time that they were able to really amass enough wealth and influence, the Republican Party, which was already in existence, we're talking 1857, they were exerting a lot of pressure upon the Buchanan administration to sort of distance themselves from the filibusters and of course, the radical Southern politicians at the time who wanted Southern expansion for the sake of economic and political influence. And so, because of that, nothing really came about the actual planning and funding for an expedition by Bickley and his forces. As a matter of fact, a lot of people called Bickley a fraud. A lot of people were leaving the Knights of the Golden Circle angry because nothing was coming about for an expedition in Mexico or an expedition to Cuba. And so, but Walker, on the other hand, he actually accomplishes this and is recognized as a legitimate government. Now, the reason why Walker fails is because he just angered the wrong people. And of course, the person he angered the most was Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was actually in charge of a shipping enterprise into Nicaragua. And so Cornelius Vanderbilt's the Accessory Transit Company, actually, that's what the name of it was. Yeah. And so he actually seizes two ships that belonged to Cornelius Vanderbilt's Accessory Transit Company and refuses to give it back. He basically requisitioned it and said, hey, look, we're doing this. We need to expand. We need ships for our Navy, and we're just going to seize these ships because we feel like it. We're recognized by the U.S. government. What are you going to do? And well, what did Cornelius Vanderbilt do? Well, he does what most ultra wealthy people do. He used his wealth and leveraged it to get the Costa Rican government to aid the rebels in Nicaragua and had Walker overthrown. Walker then was actually captured by the United States government. But rather than be taken here to the United States, he was taken back and he was executed in 1860.
Why do you think the U.S. government? I mean, I guess was it because it was the Lincoln administration more or less at that point, or was it? Do you think that the U.S. government kind of said, "Well, our loose end in Nicaragua has been basically caught, and best for international reasons." Kind of like I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but if you believe in some of the Epstein stuff, if you believe about basically like people think like, well, he was caught, so they kind of had to more or less let him die. Do you think he was kind of more something on that? Like, well, he got caught. Um, to cover our tracks, he has to die. Do you think that's why they gave him back?
Well, no, the reason why they gave him back was because of the pressure of Vanderbilt. and so Vanderbilt, he goes back, and then he actually survived that rush. But then in 1860, he goes back on his own, tried one more time, and then that's when he is just executed. They just captured him. Funny enough, the British Royal Navy, actually, I believe it was, that they got involved and arrested him and brought him in, and they just executed him. They let the natives have him, kill him, and that was it in 1860. So he just angered the wrong people, and they just said, well, Vanderbilt said, I'm going to make sure that I end your career, basically.
Well, that should serve as a lesson to our viewers that if you're going to make people mad, make the unless that's the goal to make the right people mad. Don't make people mad that unnecessarily mad that can ruin you. Um, if there's a lesson to be learned today that's not history, make your enemies wisely. Choose your enemies wisely. Well, we don't always choose our enemies, but sometimes we have to make people our enemies by making the right choice. Um, do you think you could maybe touch on the Knights of the Golden Circle during the outbreak of the Civil War? What some of their operations were, what they mainly did during the war, things of that nature, who their leader was in the war. I know Albert Pike had some involvement possibly with them.
Yeah, so again, the Knights of the Golden Circle, prior to the war, their whole deal was prepping for an invasion of Latin America. But right on the eve of the war in 1860, they went from American expansionism to Southern nationalism and secession. So the main goal of these castles was to essentially ensure that the counties that they were located in, specifically in Texas, they played a big role in Texas's secession, especially by a man by the name of Benjamin McCulloch.
Yes, I know him.
You know, he was a member of the Knights of the
You
Golden
know,
Circle
you
in
know,
Texas.
the funny thing about him is that, and this I don't want to go off on a tangent, is when Davy Crockett was going to Texas, Ben McCulloch was the guy that was with him, that was traveling with him. Well, 2 weeks before the Alamo fell, Ben McCulloch got sick, and I believe him and Davy were in Nacogdoches, which is on East Texas. And Davy Crockett had to leave Ben McCulloch in Nacogdoches while he went to the Alamo. And had Ben McCulloch not been sick, he would have been one of the men that was killed at the Alamo.
Yeah, it's an incredible story when I read that. He was actually, so if I'm not mistaken, Ben McCulloch and his, I believe he had a brother as well. They were actually at the Battle of San Jacinto.
They were, for my memory at least, they both he was.
Yeah, he was able to make it to the Battle of San Jacinto, but had he actually gone to San Antonio with David Crockett, yeah, he would have been among the slain at the Alamo. He would have shared their fate, which fortunately that wouldn't be the case, and he would become a Texas Ranger. He would actually fight in the Mexican War. He also, of course, afterward would lead the Knights of the Golden Circle in Texas. He was one of the key figures, and so he had a lot of influence over the secessionist activity in Texas. He knew a lot of members of the legislature, and of course, he exerted a lot of pressure on then Governor Sam Houston to either vote in favor of seceding or step down. And so he was behind a lot of those efforts. There were other people there as well who would later on fight in the Confederacy. Lewis T. Wigfall, the senator from Texas, he was also a member. He actually formed the Texas Brigade before General Hood would take over. He was the initial colonel of the Texas Brigade, Wigfall. And these people were all working together to essentially effectuate Southern secession and prepare for war. Because unlike a lot of Southerners who thought, well, there probably won't be a war because it's unconstitutional to invade your fellow countrymen, the Knights of the Golden Circle, they saw it as, yeah, we have to prepare for the eventual outcome of secession, which will be war, so we're going to have a Southern army come together. And so they were marching, they were holding torchlight rallies at night for secession in Savannah, in Charleston, in New Orleans, also in San Antonio, Texas, in Austin, Texas as well, the capital. So they were doing different things in different states, but all more or less the same, towards the same goal, which was to promote the secession of the southern states. And the ultimate goal of that was to not only promote the secession of the southern states, but have the southern states secede and form a new government. And then, of course, with that new government, under their auspices, then go down and take Latin America.
I see. Now I know that you said that like Mexico is part of the Golden Circle. Well, from my understanding, when the French invade Mexico under the auspices of putting what's his name on the Emperor Maximilian of Austria on the throne, does that change the dynamic with Mexico? Because it seems like Mexico becomes almost an ally of the CSA and more or less maybe a fellow partner in promoting this idea of a industrious golden circle, if we want to call it that.
Well, it was actually a lot more complicated than that. So at the very beginning of the war, this is right before the full scale invasion by France. So at this time, Mexico is already experiencing a war of its own, which France exploits. There was already a war going on between Benito Juarez and his liberals and the other factions who were in charge of what was known as the provinces, the provincias, or Mexican states. And a lot of these individuals were very much, traditionalist Catholics, and then Juarez was more, left wing, progressive, and he saw himself as an indigenous oppressed minority fighting against the criollos and their Catholic traditional rule. And so what the Confederates did is that they sent agents to Coahuila, they sent agents to Veracruz, to different parts of Mexico to essentially effectuate some sort of agreement to have open trade because of the blockade and so forth. And some efforts were successful, some not so much. However, because of these efforts, we were able to have the port of Matamoros become a major center for trade, weapons and so forth from abroad, mostly from England and so forth. So, but until 1862, that's what was going on. As a matter of fact, the Confederacy briefly made a treaty with Juarez himself, but of course Juarez double-crossed the Confederate agents who had gone there, and that didn't go anywhere. As a matter of fact, Juarez assured the federal soldiers they could march through Mexico if needed, if they ever decided to invade Texas, or if they wanted to get troops through Mexico to get from to California, or so on and so forth. And so that's what was going on until 1862. Now the picture changes in 1862 because you have this massive European power invade, and you have Maximilian, who, for all intents and purposes, all he wants to do is collect payments and install a puppet government in Mexico, because Mexico was in debt to them and also to Spain and also to England. So not just France. So you had several European powers who had an interest in Mexico's capitulation to France. And of course, the Confederacy saw it as an enormous advantage and opportunity. So absolutely, they were talking about having a protectorate with Maximilian's government. And of course, they wanted to sort of have an open trade agreement with Maximilian to get supplies into the Confederacy, which they successfully did. That's why Texas, despite the fact that the war was going on, I mean, sure, there no real battles happened in Texas, but that part of the Confederacy, what was known as the Trans-Mississippi Theater, even though they were isolated, they were well supplied and equipped as opposed to the rest of the Confederate States because of the fact that we had an open alliance with Mexico. So yeah, that changed things a lot, and we sort of were already achieving our goals in terms of having influence in Mexico until, of course, the war ends, and then, well, the rest is history.
Yes. So when you're regarding talking about the those well supplied troops into Trans Mississippi, I believe you said Trans Mississippi. Um, what do you mean by they're better supplied and better equipped? Are you speaking maybe in terms of like they're able to just get more provisions like food and things like that to them? Are they actually like better equipped in a sense of weaponry and uniforms and horses and things of that nature?
Well, they're definitely better provisioned. Yeah, that's the word I should use. They were better provisioned. They were able to get actual foodstuffs through Mexico. They were actually able to get material and, of course, saltpeter for their ammunition. They were able to obtain all these things through the Mexican port of Matamoros. They were able to do all that and basically subsist off that trade, whereas the rest of the Confederacy was totally isolated. And that was because of the diplomacy. As a matter of fact, there's a book made by Frank Lawrence Owsley, one of the agrarians. Frank Lawrence Owsley, he actually wrote a book called Cotton Diplomacy, and it talks about this cotton trade and all of this bargaining going on between Mexico and the Confederate States on the Texas-Mexico border and in the port of Matamoros. And it was a phenomenon because, it was a deviation from the norm. Most southern ports were being strangled. Meanwhile, Texas on the border is pretty much doing all right, despite the fact that you have the Federals in Galveston. You have several raids into Brownsville. There was a lot going on there. And of course, you had the Cortina War between 1859 and 1861, which, this is something totally unrelated, but there was actually a moment where both the U.S. troops and the Confederate soldiers fought on the same side. And you know why that was? To basically expel Juan Cortina and his invading band from the state of Texas. So, if only we can get together and expel invaders from our borders again, right? But anyway.
Yeah. I know. I've heard of that event, and I think Juan Cortina might have carried on like the 1870s, and he was stopped again by like a 5'3" Texas Ranger with a serious attitude that tried to get federal cavalry to help him, and basically they wouldn't because they didn't want to interfere with Mexico. They didn't want to cross the border, so he and a few of like Rangers basically independently crossed the border and picked the fight with these banditos, and I believe they killed them all.
Yeah.
Something to that effect. I don't know if that's true, but I was listening to something about that a few months ago, and that reminded me of it.
Yeah, I've actually heard of that, and yeah, it just goes back to, again, getting together and putting some real border security to use, right? That's what we need now. That's for sure. But yeah, so back to the Knights of the Golden Circle, they were very much involved in that. As a matter of fact, one of the key members in the Confederate delegation to Mexico was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle as well, and a filibuster, and he was also Cuban. And his name was Jose Agustin Quintero, and he had been chosen to be a diplomat to the Mexican state of Coahuila, and so he was able to become good friends with the governor there, and he was able to sort of manage relations between Mexico and Texas. And he was bilingual. He knew enough Southern manners to do well by the Confederates. He knew enough Latin, Spanish mannerisms to also get along with Mexico, obviously, and even the French. And so therefore, that's how the Knights were involved. They had their agents on the scene. As a matter of fact, one of the key commanders in the border was John Rip Ford, who was a Knights of the Golden Circle member. And John Ford was famous for fighting the Battle of Palmetto Ranch in 1865.
Well, you're talking
The so-called last battle of the war. He was one of the people in charge on the border there, and he was overseeing these operations. And yes, he was a knight as well. And so that's more or less what the Knights were doing in Mexico. Now, in the rest of the South, they are unfortunately disintegrating. They've lost a lot of their ranks in the military. By 1863, they are absolutely destroyed. You have federal agents who have infiltrated the ranks and have written exposés on the Knights of the Golden Circle. And of course, and this is totally true, by the way. John Wilkes Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. He was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, and he actually joined their militia, and there's even an image of him with the Knights of the Golden Circle militia in Richmond in 1861. It's a very very famous black and white photo of him that I love. It's anyway, and so there were several plots that the Knights of the Golden Circle were formulating to rid themselves of Lincoln, and so this drew the eye of many federal informants, and of course of what would then become the Secret Service, and so they were infiltrated. They were broken up from the within, and they formed something else called the Order of the Sons of Liberty in 1863. And they would only continue to decline from there. Obviously, with the end of the war, they saw that their dream for expansion would not be realized until many, many years later. And, they still had a great influence, though, and this is why later on you would see efforts to annex the Dominican Republic in 1873 with Ulysses S. Grant. You would, of course, see us almost going to war with Spain in I believe this was 1876. And then, of course, the Spanish-American War many years later. Most of the members of the Knights of the Golden Circle were dead by that time, but the younger members were around and they were all for it. But at this point, without the benefit of hindsight, as far as they knew, it was over and the entire organization was falling apart. George Bickley himself, as I mentioned, he was captured and taken in as a prisoner of war in 1863 by the Federals. He was held in a prison. It escapes me now the name of that prison, but he unfortunately is completely disconnected from all operations for the duration of the war because of that.
So I heard you earlier. You said John Ford. Do you mean like John Rip Ford?
Exactly. Yes.
Oh wow, I didn't know he was a. I guess I haven't done. I know a lot of these names and these people, but like actually like figuring out like who's a member and who's not. It's kind of like I know that name. And it's like I didn't realize he was that. Do you know a little bit about Albert Pike?
Yeah, it's funny. Albert Pike is another colorful character who I absolutely love. He's an absolute Renaissance man, and he was just the ideal of the Victorian gentleman. I mean, he was just somebody who was so fascinating, right? I mean, the lore behind him, So Albert Pike, he comes down into Arkansas in the 1830s, settles in what is now Little Rock, Arkansas, and obviously he's a Freemason, and he is very much favorable to expansion. He fought in the Mexican War, and so he does contribute a significant amount of resources as well as structural ideas to the Knights of the Golden Circle because of his involvement in Freemasonry, which actually all of these, if not most of these men in charge of the leadership, they were. And so Albert Pike, he would be able to advise the Arkansas Castle as to what George Bickley ought to do, who he should talk to in the political field, because Albert Pike had a lot of connections. And so that was his involvement. He never really got too deep in it to where he was attending national meetings, but certainly he had a heavy hand in Arkansas, and he was definitely in correspondence with Bickley and other members, especially McCulloch. Albert Pike and McCulloch were actually very close friends, and of course they would serve together in the same theater and fight together in the only battle that they ever fought, major battle, should I say, because McCulloch fought in several skirmishes prior to the Battle of Pea Ridge in 1862, where he would die. And so he and Ben McCulloch were constantly trading information. They were both fellow Freemasons, so they were working together to advance KGC goals in the state of Arkansas and Texas, respectively. So that's where Albert Pike comes in. And of course, Albert Pike was also an attorney, So he was doing his best to sort of bring about legislation in Congress and so forth, and influence lawmakers to be as loose with the Knights of the Golden Circle as possible and give them as much leeway to operate as possible as well. So that's more or less where he comes into the picture.
Now I know that when the Confederate government formed, he was over the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the Confederate government. Do you know if there was any involvement with the KGC in what we call Oklahoma today?
Actually, there was, and that was under his supervision, as well as somebody named Elkanah Greer. Brigadier General Elkanah Greer served under Pike and McCulloch, and so they were out there basically trying to form a castle there. They weren't successful, but they were trying to form a castle there with the Indian tribes, and of course, their main military force from San Antonio that went into the Indian Territory. They were mostly Knights of the Golden Circle members, so they certainly were operating up there and trying to recruit into the ranks the civilized tribe, the Cherokee, and so forth. And they were open to it; they absolutely were. So they were certainly active. And Elkanah Greer, McCulloch, and Albert Pike were essentially at the forefront of all KGC operations, respectively from 1860 to 1862. And of course, Albert Pike would, after the Battle of Pea Ridge, he would desert from the Confederate Army because he was charged for basically having his Cherokee soldiers. He was charged for, I believe it was, I can't remember the exact crime, but I know that his men in the Cherokee troops that he was commanding, I believe there's also some Choctaw, they actually scalped dead Union soldiers, and several Confederate officials didn't take too kindly to that, so they saw to it that he was charged, and so he summarily left his position as Brigadier General. And that was pretty much the end of his operations with the Knights of the Golden Circle and the Confederacy from there.
That's kind of odd, when you have, figures like, Nathan Bedford Forrest, you have Stonewall Jackson, talking about how the only way that, basically this war can be ended is if, they were to drive up north and, vandalize the so-called Vandals that destroyed, Fredericksburg. I find it funny that the Confederate government in a defensive war was concerned about things like scalping in a far western theater that is kind of inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. It maybe it shows they weren't as barbaric as mainstream history likes to portray them as.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As a matter of fact, it's funny you mentioned that. That's exactly the charge that they hit Albert Pike with: barbarism. He wasn't looking out for his men. He got these red savages and he just unleashed them onto the Yankee troops, which, for all, looking back, I can see why they would say that, because yes, Yankees and Southerners culturally were different, but in the grand scheme of things, they were from similar stock. They both prayed to the same God. They both shared a similar culture and customs. Some had family in the North. It was quite literally brother against brother in many cases. So I could see why they saw it that way. They saw these, red savages just scalping these men. And so they hit Albert Pike with barbarism, and that forced him to resign, thus concluding his role in the Knights of the Golden Circle and the war. But this is a time with the Knights of the Golden Circle. Again, they were on their way out, and they became the Order of Sons of Liberty, and they had a big role, by the way, in actually helping out Clement Bellingham, the senator from Ohio, getting down into the South and escaping Lincoln's wrath. And so they were good friends of his and big fans, and they also did a lot to spread dissent in the North. Rumor is that they were behind the draft riots of 1863. I don't know if that's true.
Really, really, really.
And
I didn't know that. Who do you know who posited that the basically the KGC was behind the draft riots?
well, it's actually the source I'm getting that from is a book that was published a few. It was published a few years ago, and so the book is actually called. It's a great book. I actually have it in my bookshelf here. As I'm speaking to you, I'm trying to find it because I have a lot of different books on the subject. But yeah, they were allegedly connected to that. They were really established. Again, they had castles in the north, especially in Indiana and Ohio. So they were suspected of aiding what was known as the Copperhead movement in the north as well, and putting a lot of influence on them to sort of call for an end of the war. There was even, rumors that McClellan was involved with them. It was insane. There was a lot of paranoia. They were like, I don't know, how could I describe it? There was a lot of paranoia with them, and they were like the boogeyman of the radical Republicans, essentially. And the Lincoln administration, you had different uh, conspiracies about how the Knights of the Golden Circle were planning to assassinate Lincoln. And after Lincoln's assassination, as a matter of fact, several newspapers even published quote unquote exposés on how there was actually a plot and so forth. But yeah, so the source I got this from is a great book, by the way, guys. This is and I recommend it. Couldn't recommend it more. The book is called Knights of the Golden Circle: Secret Empire, Southern Secession, Civil War, and the author is David C. Keene, and this book is probably the authority on this subject, and I can't recommend it enough. It's a short read, 328 pages, but yeah, they had alleged that these people were behind all of these things, the Knights of the Golden Circle, and so they became like the boogeymen. You mentioned Knights of the Golden Circle, and everybody in Lincoln's cabinet would just jump. It's pretty amusing to read about, and so that's what they were doing at that stage of the war. After the war, of course, then you have the whole rumor of KGC Gold, Jesse James, and the Knights of the Golden Circle, all that fun stuff. Which I really don't know if it's true or not, but if it is true, I want to know where that gold is. I don't know.
Yeah, I've heard some rumors about that. I've heard rumors about that it's buried in Indiana. I've heard that, yeah, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, and that Jesse James buried it. I don't know how true that is. Do you know anything about supposed Jesse James' involvement in the KGC?
I actually don't, and again, I don't really want to touch upon that because a lot of it is fabricated. There's not a lot to substantiate that. Now, there is something to substantiate Knights of the Golden Circle involvement with Quantrill, because Quantrill, as you know, went to Texas several times. Quantrill was very much involved with a lot of the Knights of the Golden Circle in Texas, so that's probably where that comes in. But Jesse James himself, I could not say.
Interesting. See, I mainly much of my background with a lot of this stuff comes from like honestly like the American Unearthed or America Unearthed like TV show, or more of these like the Oak Island stuff. Like there was an Oak Island episode I think where like the maybe not an episode, but like some of the crew went to Georgia to look for the gold because Jefferson Davis was captured in Georgia at the end of the war, and people were saying that he buried it there. But I guess as we're following like this kind of sort of like timeline, um, so you said that the KGC they changed their name to a different organization. Did they try anything after the war? Like what's happening after the war for them? Like, what does that look like as an organization?
Well, after the war, as I said, they were mostly broken up, and they, this is during Reconstruction, so the entire South, for all intents and purposes, is in ruin, and so therefore they're not really up to a whole lot. They are very inactive, and so their goal is mostly preservation and basically rebuilding. They were rebuilding what had been lost under the name the Order of the Sons of Liberty. And afterward, once the Reconstruction of the South ends in 1877 and reconciliation starts to take place, they were able to, some of the younger members, they were able to sort of continue to steer that expansionist ideal into the ranks of the U.S. government. You had many prominent Southerners who did that, and of course, as you know, in the Spanish American War, we had people like Joseph Wheeler fight. We had Robert E. Lee's son fight as well, and there was a reason for this because this is what they wanted, and so they were finally getting Cuba and fighting a just war against a foreign enemy who, for all intents and purposes, didn't belong there. So yeah, it was something that they were very, very much looking forward to and involved in after the war. But as far as the organization itself, as far as the gold and all of that, there isn't a whole lot to substantiate any of those claims. And for all intents and purposes, I'm going to say that they pretty much fell apart after Bickley's arrest, after the complete and total dissolution of the Confederacy. And so that, unfortunately, that would be the end of that. Everything after that is hearsay mostly. And so if the Knights of the Golden Circle continued after the war, they were very secretive, and maybe it was for the best because maybe they were onto something, and we have yet to learn what that was. But the Knights of the Golden Circle, though, they were actually not the first organization of its kind to promote expansionism, to promote filibustering. Filibustering itself is a very old, again, as you said, it's part of the Anglo tradition. So to go back in time a little bit, the very first filibusters were actually taking place in the capturing of the Northwest Territory, and also in Daniel Boone's expeditions into Kentucky, Virginia's conquering of Ohio. That could be argued as filibuster, and
Or Texas.
We're going there. We're actually going to go there, and so we had a period where, again, the United States was surrounded by enemies, and they just said, well, you know what, we're going to take all this land because it's just there. We don't need any more people surrounding us. Let's make it ours. And so that's where, you can call, it's funny, I always say Thomas Jefferson was one of the greatest filibusters ever, aside from Sam Houston, and that's because, he bought the Louisiana Territory for just $15 million. He basically just said, "Hey, yeah."
Well, it's funny too because you got to think about it in this way as well, that the United States is surrounded at that time, surrounded by enemies. It's 1 against 5. You have Spain, who Spain has always been sort of kind of antagonistic to anything Anglo. They might not be at war, but just because the Americans switch from allegiance to London, to allegiance in Washington, it doesn't really change the fact that they're still the same people that they were already had gripes with for the past 200 years. From the beginning of Jamestown, to the end of the Revolution. You know, so there's that, because I know Jackson. He had some in the Creek War. After he basically defeated the Creek in Alabama, he pushed into Florida. He invaded Florida, and it was good that there was no Spanish army really there to oppose him.
Yeah, yeah.
Otherwise, it would have been a
Battle
war.
of Negro Fort.
Mhm. And so you have that. You have Britain. You have France. Even though France is an ally, they're a quite unstable country. Post American Revolution. Circa French Revolution, and there was I know there was the Quasi War, which was like basically an unofficial naval war against France that had occurred. That I believe was kind of sort of a not really, nobody really wanted the war. It was more like the people at sea were fighting a war, and there was that. Um, and then you have the natives who outnumber all the Europeans more or less to some extent, but they're split up into different groups that have shifting alliances that have their own end goals, and that not all the natives were like Tecumseh that wanted a massive Indian nation. Um, a lot of them wanted their the success of their small little tribes, and ultimately that's what hurt them at the end of the day. That and their ability to really not organize well. And I don't mean to go off on a tangent, because I have plans to make a series about the Creek War in Alabama, a full series on it. But we see places like Horseshoe Bend where the natives literally build a essentially European style fortifications, trench networks, and things of that nature to take on a American army in the field. They still lose. So the Americans, it's just kind of interesting. It's like the idea is that they're surrounded, they're outnumbered by 5-1, but the way they're going to solve that is to go on the offensive. Attack this, attack that. And I guess my main goal is that even though America's outnumbered 5-1 on paper, it's not really the case, because, as I said, there's no Spanish army really in Florida. The British army's tied up in Europe fighting, and we've beat the British army before in the field. It can happen. The French are, very, shifty. They're kind of an ally, kind of not sometimes. But ultimately, France is more or less getting out of America. They've lost all their Canadian possessions. They're selling the Louisiana territory to America, so they're not really even relevant. And then the natives, we've been fighting natives since we got here. We know how to do that. So really, that when you look at it that way, it kind of makes sense why they could go in these piecemeal moves and invade places. And I guess also what I meant by they're outnumbered is that you have the Spanish, but you also have the Spanish colonies who more or less throw off Spain. They're a potential enemy as well, as we saw with Mexico. And none of these groups are as organized as America, and America is able to use these their history of doing these expeditions, and their fighting abilities, their natural genetics. I mean, let's be real here. Most Anglos are tall, strong guys, tall, strong men. I mean, you read any account of what people in Kentucky looked like at those times, they were all like 6 foot tall, muscular men.
Yeah, Scots Irish. Scots Irish stock.
Yes, Scotch Irish, and we don't give we give a lot of credit to the Scotch Irish for being of that build, but even the Puritans that come over to America, I mean, these are, these are the people that are from East Anglia. I mean, this is, you look at the Sutton Hoo burial mound in England. That's Puritan stock right there. These are warrior people too, in a sense.
Yeah, no, they fought the bloodiest. Funny, nobody realizes this.
I mean, like Oliver Cromwell, in his, Puritans took over England.
Yeah, well, that too. But they also people think, when they think about the Indian Wars, they think either about the Seminole Wars, they think about the taming of the West between the 1850s and the 1880s. But the bloodiest race war and Indian War, I'm a big fan of Christopher Sandach, and I love him. He's a shout out to him now because he actually was the one that informed me about this. So I gotta give kudos to him. So the bloodiest race war in American history was fought in New England. It was actually King Philip's War in 1675, roughly. Yeah, and I read about it. There's a book on it called The Name of War. The author escapes me now, but it's called The Name of War, and it was absolutely brutal. And this was fought by people from East Anglia. This was fought by the Puritans. But again, as I said before, it's because of this reason that during the Civil War and afterward, once the bitterness, the the resentment, that spirit of hate that existed between North and South after the war because of Reconstruction, once that recedes during reconciliation, they grow a profound respect for each other again because, again, at the end of it all, they're both of similar stock, and they both took part in what was the raising of this wilderness together. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and I'm not sure where I was gonna go with that, but do you think that maybe some of the KGC ideas or what influenced later American imperialism in like the Teddy Roosevelt era, you could say?
Well, again, it's funny because Teddy Roosevelt, he was basically he was a WASP, and his uncle served in the Confederate Navy, so he was of Southern and New England stock, and so the Roosevelt corollary was essentially all for what most Southern expansionists wanted, which was dominion over as much of Latin America and the realm as possible, and in the outer realms as possible, for of course the benefit of the United States. So a lot of libertarians and all these other people will say, well, that's globalism. No, that was unadulterated Americanism for the benefit of Heritage America and the well-being of the United States economy and military power. So Roosevelt was not like our modern elites who just fighting all these endless, senseless wars for the sake of profit or for the sake of economic expansion on the terms of our modern conception of consumer culture, democracy, or any of these abstract ideas. Roosevelt was an actual all-out nationalist, and that's why we see the Roosevelt corollary. That's why we see Roosevelt's modernization of our Navy, because yeah, in a lot of ways, this expansionist spirit, which we call manifest destiny later, earlier on, was behind that drive. Because again, the United States was one of the greatest governments ever built at that time, and probably has been since. I mean, if you look at Europe today, you can certainly say so. And there was no reason why they could not doubt their abilities to be a power on the global stage. And by the 1890s and 1900s, people north and south would have agreed to that. They would have said, yeah, there's no reason why we cannot be not only a power in the Americas, but in the world as well. And so the idea, the concept that the vast majority of Americans were against what we call today globalism in this time is actually not entirely true. Yes, there were isolationists. Yes, there were people who were speaking against that. And maybe there were some things that were probably not entirely correct about that stance, but at least the intention behind it was Anglo-American domination and Anglo-American supremacy as far as we could achieve it.
And now today we are seeing the fruits of that, come back to us in more or less a negative way. Maybe it could have been positive, but right now we're definitely seeing all across the world. We're seeing what would I call it? Reverse colonialism, where the colonies are coming back to the motherland, and it's definitely causing problems. I don't know if we can definitely say that is the fruits of colonialism and expansionism and all that, but we it seems like it is to a lot of people, but we don't know if that's actually it or if that's just that we mitigated our situation poorly and have allowed that to happen, and that was not the that was not the that was not the only outcome that was possible of that situation.
Yeah,
Well,
I
go ahead.
think, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, go ahead.
No, I think that a lot could have gone differently had the actual vision of our original elites been maintained. Later on, obviously, we would very much change our direction. We would go from spreading Anglo supremacy to spreading quote unquote democracy. For similar reasons, but not entirely. Of course, that would happen after World War II. Our entire view on foreign policy would continue to shift dramatically to what we see it today. But of course, I'm not going to go into that tangent. But back to the United States, right after the revolution, we're looking at a young republic outnumbered 5-1. And what's going on is that there are areas in dispute. Already after the Constitutional Convention of 1787, people are asking, well, we have this area in Georgia, particularly southwest Georgia, that borders what we call the West Florida border. And they're thinking to themselves, well, do we or do we not go to war with Spain over it? And Spain had actually assisted the colonists in obtaining their independence. Spain declared war on Britain in 1779. And of course, they would fight the battles of Baton Rouge, battles of Mobile, the Battle of Pensacola, where they wrested control of Florida back into the Spanish crown. Because very briefly, for 10 years, Florida and what we know as the Florida East and West was under English control, which is why you have a presence of English settlers in East and West Florida. And also the division, by the way, that was done by the English, not the Spanish. They just maintained it that way because they thought, well, that actually makes it easier for us to govern because we could just split the two states. We don't have any real assets here anyhow. So from 1763 to 1781, the Floridas are under British control. Bernardo de Galvez, who was he was the viceroy of Mexico, of New Spain and Mexico, and he was in charge of this army raised in Cuba, and they basically took Florida. And so after all that is done, Florida is back in Spanish control, but the founders, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, obviously, and all the rest, they're getting together and they're thinking, well, we have this territory here that's conflicting because this is Georgia, but they're claiming it for them. So they get together in 1795. They do something called the Pinckney Treaty. Now, the Pinckney Treaty essentially was brought about by a man named Charles Pinckney, and it settled the controversy between the boundary of Southwest Georgia and what was known as West Florida. And then, of course, later on, they would form the 31st parallel, which would be moved further south with that exact treaty, because basically Spain wanted to take a big chunk of Georgia, northern Alabama, and other parts of the northern and the western territories. And of course, the colonists, they were like, no way. This is ours. We conquered it. You have no claim to anything above, Mobile, Alabama, and Baton Rouge. That's all. That's yours. This is ours. And so they moved the former boundary, which was a big chunk of West Georgia, further south through the 31st parallel, which is known as the Ellicott line. And the Ellicott line was approved in 1798. And so from that moment on, the Ellicott line would serve as the territorial boundary between Spanish Florida and the United States, with the Treaty of San Lorenzo, or the Treaty of Thomas Pinckney, who was sent there to actually effectuate that. So therefore, that's where tensions between Spain and the colonists begins. However, at this time, the founding fathers really think, we shouldn't be dealing with these people anymore. Events in Europe are really spinning out of control. And it's funny because Thomas Jefferson, he's a big Francophone. He loves France. He is horrified of England. But he's seen the events in France unfold, and at first he's supportive of it. Then later on, he's sort of, second guessing himself, and he's asking questions. And then he's basically comes to the conclusion that, maybe we don't want Europe anywhere near our borders and boundaries, and we might want to expand and sort of kick them out completely. And that is what they all sort of come to a consensus on. And early on, there will be much, much greater interest in West Florida and Florida in general. But even more so, they turn their attention more than any other place to the land of my heritage, which is Cuba. And this is where it gets interesting. So they turn their eyes on Cuba because it's right below Florida. It is the strategic key to the Caribbean and the West Indies. It's centered right between Florida and the Gulf of Mexico. So naturally, that was a very attractive piece of geography. And Thomas Jefferson, more than anybody else, voiced his interest for Cuba as early as 1804. And he basically said this: I had ever looked on Cuba as the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states, and her addition to the United States is exactly what is wanting to advance our power as a nation to the points of its utmost interest. We must have Cuba. Those are his words verbatim. So early on, as you can see, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are both going back and forward about Cuba. And once Thomas Jefferson realizes the Louisiana Purchase, the question of annexation of the West Florida territory comes up, and it's James Madison's administration that inherits that issue. So James Madison is obviously a protege of Jefferson. He's a Jeffersonian, so he loves the Jeffersonian ideal of a republic of republics. And so he loves the idea of spreading republicanism as far and wide as possible. And therefore, he starts to immediately get involved with the situation in West Florida. And what he does is that he establishes contact with and basically almost daily correspondence with a man by the name of, let me see here, I apologize, but his name was, it escapes me now, his name was William his name was Claiborne. William Claiborne, who was the governor of Orleans Territory. And this becomes Jefferson and Madison's man on the scene. So Orleans Territory is that tiny bit of, so basically the Louisiana Territory was not just Louisiana. It was modern day Missouri. It was a big chunk of land. And that by that time it was actually given to Meriwether Lewis, if I'm not mistaken. He was the first territorial governor, the second territorial governor of that region. So Orleans Territory is basically New Orleans, obviously. And this man, William Claiborne, he is the man on the scene. And James Madison basically says, look, I want you to, as much as you possibly can, spy on the English settlers who fled Georgia and South Carolina as loyalists. I want you to spy on them and basically foment as much as you can unrest among their ranks with the Spanish, and basically facilitate a way to get these people to rebel, remove the Spanish control, and make West Florida a part of the United States. And he agrees to that. He says, yes, I'll do that, and I will make sure that whatever happens there, we do not intervene. We're not going to stop anybody from coming over and starting a rebellion in West Florida. And so they basically have the first U.S.-sponsored filibuster. And that's when Claiborne gets in touch with somebody named Reuben Kemper. And Reuben Kemper, and this is where it really gets interesting because this is, I love this story. This is the story of the Republic of West Florida. And the very first West Florida rebellion was then effectuated by a man named Reuben Kemper in 1804, and his brothers, Samuel and his other brother, the other Kemper brother, they all sort of collaborate with the other English locals who are dismayed at Spanish control. Now, at this time, the territorial governor of West Florida, Grand Pre was his name, he was on his way out. He was actually very well liked. He was kind of a pushover. So Grand Pre was a pushover. He was half French, half Spanish, and he sort of just did whatever the English told him to do. But then this other man takes over, this man named De Lassus, and De Lassus sort of begins to take a more dictatorial approach towards these English settlers. And he reminds them that they're Spanish, that they're subject to Spain. He starts to crack down their businesses. There was a lot of corruption going on in the Republic of West Florida. Okay, the Republic of West Florida was not, it was not a place for good, upstanding people. Okay, the Kemper brothers themselves were actually troublemakers. They were actually kind of
as much of the American frontier was in those days. Usually it wasn't the most well-to-do people. It was the most aggressive, the most volatile types going out that way. Daniel Boone is kind of a rare exception to that, from my understanding. But many of the those going on the fringes of the known world at that time were not the most accommodatable in society.
No, not at all. And so, the Republic of West Florida was basically an anarchy at this point, because think about it. Spain is crumbling. And then, of course, in 1807, Napoleon invades Spain. So the first Kemper Rebellion takes place roughly 3 years before that, in 1804. It is put down. De Lassus is able to effectively retain his rule. But then, between Claiborne's meddling in affairs and between enough pressure from the Kempers and from other disaffected residents of the Republic of West Florida, they're able to break away from Spanish rule. Now, it's interesting how this happens, because there's another man on the scene who's sort of guiding events, and he's another favorite political figure of mine, and historical figure as well. His name is Fulworth Skipworth. Now, Fulworth Skipworth was a Virginian, just like Thomas Jefferson, and he actually knew Thomas Jefferson very well, because his cousin, Henry Skipworth, was the brother-in-law to Thomas Jefferson. So Fulworth was through and through an aristocrat. He was probably the most aristocratic person there, actually. And so, of course, between him and Claiborne, and of course, James Madison himself, they were able to sort of work together a plot to overthrow the Spanish, and they did. And on September 23rd, 1810, they actually led an army there, led by General Philemon Thomas and Major Isaac Johnson. They all had this army led by these men. Isaac Johnson being the man who had the Bonnie Blue flag, the Lone Star flag, the very first symbol of resistance to tyranny ever flown in the South. It was hoisted above the fort in Baton Rouge on September 23rd, 1810, and Fuller Skipworth was made the governor because he was the real, aristocrat on the scene. He was made the governor because of his qualifications, and they were effectively made an independent republic for 3 months. And so finally, there was a lot of discussion going on as to how their next move was going to be made. And initially, a lot of people in the Republic of West Florida, a lot of the Englishmen and Americans who were living there, they basically were at first favorable to annexation, but then they said, we like the anarchy. We like the fact that we don't have to pay any tariffs. We like the fact that we have our own government. So, let's just stay that way. And that's why when James Madison has the governor of Orleans Territory send troops to basically annex West Florida, Fuller Skipworth said, I would rather die defending the Lone Star flag than submit to rule by the United States government. But of course, he acquiesced and backed down. But it's interesting. There's a lot going on in West Florida at this time. This becomes the very first effectual filibuster. And not only does this happen in this time frame, but Aaron Burr, the guy who shot Alexander Hamilton, he's on the run because of that and other things that he's done. And this is the famous Burr conspiracy to basically form his own republic. And in 1807, he's out there in West Florida trying to persuade the Kempers, trying to persuade even Claiborne to get in on the plot and basically make a republic out of Spanish Louisiana and Texas and Mexico and have him as president. So it's a pretty bizarre story. So you can say that Aaron Burr was another early filibuster. Not only was he the guy who shot Hamilton, but he was also one of the first to go out there and essentially try to create his own empire. Not for the United States' benefit, of course, for his own.
For his own.
It's a very, very interesting scenario that developed there. So there was a lot going on here. And then, of course, you had other rebellions happening, which were sponsored by Madison as well. So once West Florida is taken in, James Madison then says, okay, well, now we have the question of East Florida. And this is before Andrew Jackson would come in after this is before the Creek War. This is just like, I believe, 5 years before the Creek War, before the Battle of the Negro Fort, before all these incursions into East Florida take place. So James Madison is thinking, well, how do we get the rest of Florida now? If we successfully were able to use these land pirates to take West Florida from Spanish control,
We can take
which by that time, Spain had been invaded by Napoleon. Spain was basically not there anymore. As a matter of fact, the Captaincy General in Cuba was unable to intervene because they didn't have enough troops. They were all fighting Napoleon in Europe and Spain, trying to get the mainland back in their control. So they were just totally occupied with that. But while this was going on, Madison reads that situation and says, look, Spain is weaker now than ever. Maybe we can get all of Florida. Maybe we can actually bring all of Florida under our control with a few, bandits who we can get together and just go in there and take it. And so James Madison contracts, literally tells a man by the name of George Matthew to go down into East Florida in 1812 and take the rest of the state. And it's known as the Patriot War, the East Florida Rebellion of 1812. It's very famous, and it fails miserably, though. It fails miserably, and unfortunately, it doesn't go anywhere. And East Florida would remain under Spanish control until 1821, when
What
Andrew Jackson would.
what caused it to fail?
Well, from my understanding, it was a logistical failure. There was not enough men to effectively take. They underestimated. First of all, they underestimated Spain's amount of resources in St. Augustine and in that area, and they were not thoroughly prepared to fight a prolonged offensive in that part of the state.
And I imagine it was a very underdeveloped area too. Lots of forest and swamp, and just not really. I mean, from my understanding, Florida really didn't even develop as a state till the 1930s. As a place, there was no beach towns really. There was no resort towns. It was either basically rural farmsteads or nothing. Maybe a
No,
few small cities.
no, but it was it was a very hostile place, and so you had these Anglo troops, these colonists who were there from the time of Great Britain, and they were very sympathetic to George Matthews and his men, and of course they actually were able to establish a headquarters in Amelia Island, which is off the coast of Jacksonville, if I'm not mistaken, near Fernandina, in that area, and they were able to hold out there, and they called themselves the Patriots of Amelia Island. They then went further into the St. Johns River, and they demanded the surrender of the local forts there, Fort San Carlos. But they actually were able to raise their standard over the fort. But then once Spanish authorities were aware of what was going on, they sort of surrounded them, caused them to retreat, and also put a lot of pressure on the United States government, and they were promptly told to withdraw. And James Monroe, who was Secretary of State at the time, was sort of freaking out over this. He basically told Madison, "Are you crazy? You had this, you publicly contracted a land pirate to wrest the rest of the state of Florida for the United States. That's not how we did it in West Florida. We sort of gave them covert, we subtly supported them, but we didn't make it open. Whereas here, the Spanish know that we're literally supporting these guys. So I disavow." Put it in simple terms. And so by 1813, they completely and entirely abandoned the efforts and basically left George Matthews to come back. And they took possession of all of East Florida after that. Until 1821, it would remain in their possession. So that was essentially what had happened. Monroe said, "I forbear to dwell on the details of this transaction because it is too painful to recite them." And he was really embarrassed by this. So it was something that was beneath him to basically contract land pirates and take this. So he sort of just said, "Look, let's save face and back away from Matthews and then just disavow their whole thing." And that's what, no more troops were sent, no supplies. And so it just fell apart. They were just numerically outnumbered and no longer with the support of Madison's government.
All righty. Well, we're coming up to 10 minutes to being on here for 2 hours. It appears. Would if you feel like you haven't developed this further, we can film a second episode if you're down for that. Because I like to do multiple series. We can. But I feel like we've touched on tons of different things. We could develop this further into the Texas Revolution if you'd like.
Yeah, no,
Um,
absolutely. And it's interesting. So there are other characters who actually, because, the Texas Revolution, that's happening, believe it or not, that's happening right around this same period. You know, Mexico actually, beginning in 1813, Mexico is already fighting the Spanish for independence. There are several uprisings, and we have
Austin and them
something
will be
called the
moving in
Green
soon.
Republic. So the Green Republic, which was the very first effective filibuster into Texas, the first Republic of Texas was established in 1813, and what it was called was, if I'm not mistaken, it was called the McGee Gutierrez Expedition. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And the man who led the expedition was Augustus William McGee, who was an Irishman, and he was also a military man. And in 1812, 1813, he leads an expedition into Texas to fight the Spanish on behalf of Mexicans who wanted their independence. And believe it or not, one of the people involved in this expedition was none other than Samuel Kemper of West Florida Republic fame. And so all these guys are already collaborating together for Anglo-American expansion. And so you have this going on. And then, of course, after the Creek War, which also takes place in 1813, this is already, mind you, the backdrop of the War of 1812. We're at war with Britain once again. And this is very much a Southern war, because, as you know, New England was entirely opposed to the War of 1812, whereas the South was very much in favor of it. New England was in complete and total favor of the English handling our trade, because they said, well, our economy is basically based off that, so we don't want to disrupt it. Let's just leave it as it is. But the South said, no, we're Americans, and no Englishman is going to accost our sailors, basically. And so we go to war. This is the backdrop of all of this. And Andrew Jackson is fighting the Creek War, after the Fort Mims massacre. And he decides to go into Florida later on, and he fights the Battle of Negro Fort, and he continues on in fighting the Seminoles. And so Andrew Jackson can arguably call a filibuster as well. And so we have this going on, and then we have something called the Long Expedition in 1819, where James Long leads another expedition into Texas to establish an independent republic from Spain. And then in 1821, he goes back, but he is captured, he's killed. And somebody who helps him out the second time, actually both times, was the pirate John Lafitte. John Lafitte was giving logistical support to James Long in his expedition. And if I'm not mistaken, Jim Bowie, who would later die at the Alamo, this was his first time into Texas. And he actually abandoned the second expedition when he saw where it was headed, and sort of hid out with John Lafitte on one of the sandbars in Galveston along the what's called the Bolivar Peninsula. He was actually hiding out there with John Lafitte's pirates, where after they had abandoned James Long's expedition because it had broken apart and they were all captured and summarily executed by Spanish troops. So those are just early examples of the filibusters and where this sort of really takes off. Now, between the War of 1812 all the way on down through the 1820s, expansion still continues to be a area of interest for the United States, but no other country is under such scrutiny by the United States. No other, or should I say no other territory at this time, because Cuba wasn't a country then, but no other area of land was more desired than Cuba, as a matter of fact. And even in the James Monroe administration, even by that time, Monroe wanted Cuba to be a part of the United States. And he said, he actually, him and John Quincy Adams as well wanted to have Cuba as a part of the United States. And, this is surprising because, he's an old Whig. he's a New Englander, but he wanted Cuba, and he actually talked about this. In 1823, Adams wrote to the U.S. Minister of Spain at the time, Hugh Nelson. He said that if an apple, severed by the tempest of its native tree, cannot but fall to the ground, Cuba, forcibly disjointed from its own unnatural connection with Spain and incapable of self-support, can gravitate only to the North American Union, which by the same law of nature cannot be cast from her bosom. So even now, we have people like Adams, we have Monroe, we have a diverse amount of individuals in government and outside who think, yeah, we should expand our borders. And of course, this all comes to a head in 1846 with James K. Polk declaration of war on Mexico, which, think of it what you will. John C. Calhoun, one of my favorite heroes and one of the last great statesmen in American history, he was against the war, he was against expansion, but James K. Polk and the vast majority of Southern Democrats were in favor of this. And it was that really led to a major drive to have what was called Manifest Destiny expand across the Americas. Now, Manifest Destiny, this is when the word is actually coined. It's coined by a man named John Sullivan, who was a journalist for a Democrat-run newspaper in New York. I believe it was called the Democratic Sun, if I'm not mistaken. But John O. Sullivan was the man who coined the term Manifest Destiny at this time, and he basically was promoting this day and night. And in particular, the island of Cuba was the desired object of these people. And something interesting was happening in Cuba at this time. So I mentioned earlier how Spain was at war. Spain had been at war with France. Spain had been at war with Britain. So Spain was in debt. Spain was in debt. Spain was fighting its own civil war, the Carlist Wars between Isabella and King Carlos IV of Spain. And so, or was it Carlos VII? It escapes me now. But yeah, the Carlists and Queen Isabella's progressives were fighting. And so Spain was in economic trouble. They were being pressured by Great Britain to essentially give up their last global holdings in the Philippines, in Cuba obviously being the most valuable, because Cuba was basically the epicenter of sugar, of tobacco, and slaves. Cuba had more slaves per capita than the entire state of Virginia in 1845. So when all this is happening, there's something going on in Cuba. And what's going on is that the criollos, the Cuban-born native planters there, they are being squeezed very heavily by export tariffs. And not only are they being squeezed by these tariffs, they are also being threatened. They're being threatened by three things. They're being threatened by a prospect of slave uprising, which, just to give a background on that, just a few years earlier in 1798 through 1804, we had the bloody uprisings in Saint-Domingue in Haiti. And they saw this. They saw the uprisings in Saint-Domingue, in Haiti, and they saw the unrest. They saw the carnage, and they said, we are outnumbered by slaves, which is funny because this would later also be one of the main factors driving Southerners to want to expand as well, because they felt not only pressured economically and politically, but also demographically. They said to themselves, we're in too small an area, and we're the minority. Maybe we should expand our borders a bit too. This goes back to numbers again, and so Cubans think to themselves, Great Britain wants our island, and they've abolished slavery. So therefore, it's only a matter of time before we have a slave uprising here, and that happens.
Yeah, and it's like, what are they going to do with the island if they don't if the main point of having Cuba is for slave plantation agriculture, it's like, well, what's going to happen when the British take it over? It's just going to become nothing.
Yeah, and so Cuba is basically the economic powerhouse and the military powerhouse of Spain. It is the crown jewel of the Spanish Empire. So Spain doesn't want to give it up, but Spain also does not want to have to really give up too many concessions to England. So they start to cut back on their slave-driven economy. They start to really, give signs to the Creole planters that, maybe we might want to free our slaves. And not only that, but when the planters, because you see, there was a division between the planters and what was called the Peninsulares. Now, if you were a Peninsulares, if you were born in mainland Spain, if you were born in southern Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula, you were seen as of a higher caste than if you were born a Creole in Cuba. So there was distrust between the Peninsulares, and there was also a lot of just a complete and total disregard for the well-being of the Creole people in Cuba. They were being squeezed economically, and when they spoke up for their rights and said, look, very similar to the Patriots in 1776, look, you're a distant government, you are in debt, you're taxing us half to death, and we don't feel represented. What's going on? Once they addressed their grievances, basically the Spanish government said, look, if you do this again, we're going to free the slaves and put them to rule over you. So that was the last straw for the planters. And so what was done then was a man by the name of Miguel de Aldama, a very wealthy planter there, he formed something called the Havana Club. And because he was wealthy, he had influence enough to contact high-ranking officials in the United States, John Sullivan being one of them, another man by the name of William Chandler being another, and they were able to sort of contact the Polk administration and say, look, we're willing to effectuate some means to bring Cuba under your government. We want to be independent of Spain, but not just independent of Spain. We want to be a slave state. We know that you need representation in Congress. We know that the North is economically trying to supersede you and also overtake you. We know that due to massive immigration from Germany and Ireland, northern population numbers are rising. So we can help you out with this. Basically, they were saying, look, we're here. We want to be free. Come help us. And James K. Polk immediately basically said, yeah, absolutely. We would love to. And what he did was he tried to unsuccessfully purchase Cuba from Spain for $100 million in 1848. And then later on, Franklin Pierce offered $130 million in 1854, and both were turned down by Spain because, again, this was the crown jewel of the Spanish government. So this organization said, well, look, if we can't wrest Cuba legally because of pressures from the Whigs, because of pressures from Spain, we are going to do so militarily. And this is where Narciso Lopez comes in, who's another great hero of mine. And they meet with a man named John A. Quitman in Mississippi. And they formed the predecessor to the Knights of the Golden Circle called the Order of the Lone Star. And of course, yes, it's the same. They use the Bonnie Blue flag as their emblem. And they form a base in New York and another base in New Orleans. And then they form a sort of lobbying center in Washington, D.C. So they have these three areas of influence, New Orleans, Washington, and New York. And they're able to try to steer as much as they possibly could, try to steer members of Congress, members of the Senate, and of course, most notably Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. He was very much in favor of this. Also, many other senators were as well. I believe Howell Cobb. There were several people who were on board with this, and they unsuccessfully lobbied for U.S. acquisition of Cuba. So the Order of the Lone Star launched three expeditions. I'm sorry, two expeditions into Cuba, and both were unsuccessful. Now, the backdrop of this is the South wants to expand. They're under economic pressure, and this is when the rift between North and South really begins to become apparent. This is when American nationalism, when pride in the new republic begins to really die down, and the issue of slavery comes to the forefront.
Sectionalism and things. It's like it takes a break. It's like a marriage. The first fruits. The first beginning of the marriage is kind of winding down. It's becoming more of a okay. We've been a country for 50 years. It's not really special anymore. It's just routine.
Yeah, and what really causes this rift is, we had several, antecedents. We had obviously the nullification crisis of 1832. We had the Tariff of Abominations. Those are small, little, antecedents. But the real catalyst for this rift is the Wilmot Proviso immediately after the Mexican-American War, where it's basically said, the Whigs, they say, well, look, Southerners already have so much territory, but after Texas, essentially, you can't have anymore. Okay, New Mexico and all of that land that you fought for, it's going to be free. And this horrified plantation Southerners, horrified industrialist Southerners as well, and it horrified a lot of moderate Northern Democrats, because for many years there had been many different discussions and disagreements, but this was one where they knew something serious was going to come about. And so this is where the real drive for expansion goes into overdrive. Essentially, they just say, you know what, we either expand now or die. Essentially, that was the attitude. And so the Order of the Lone Star, John Quitman of Mississippi, he essentially tries his best to lobby the U.S. government in their expeditions into Cuba, but of course he's unsuccessful. And this is where the Knights of the Golden Circle will come in and continue that. And so I know we're running out of time, but this is leading into the period we were speaking of earlier. And it is such a fascinating thing, because really you can say, so there were, people always think of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Wilmot Proviso as the cause of the Civil War, but you can say that Cuba had a big role in that. And Cuba was one of the things that was under heavy contention at this time, and expansion was as well. And so really, it's interesting. So when Millard Fillmore was president right before Pierce, and what basically made Millard Fillmore so unpopular was something called the Black Warrior incident, which is where a U.S. Mailing ship called the Black Warrior was taken by Spanish authorities in the port of Havana and held. And Millard Fillmore, who was a pushover, did not want to get involved at all. I mean, Millard Fillmore being a Whig, being a New Englander.
It made it look like it was intentionally set up against the South.
Yeah, exactly. And so he was basically just dismissing it all, and the Southerners were outraged. And basically, they say Cuba undid Fillmore. That was the whole headline back then in all of the Democrat organs, So Cuba became a litmus test as to where you stood politically back then, kind of like how immigration is today. It was something that significant, and not just Cuba, but expansion as a whole. And so you had these political factors, you had these economic factors, and of course you had the cultural ties all pushing towards these individuals to do filibustering. And just a quick bit of trivia here. So the word filibuster. So there's two. People think of filibuster, they think of the U.S. House of Representatives. They think of somebody talking their head off against a bill, trying to stall a bill. Well, yeah, that's one definition for it. But the word filibuster, in the sense we've been talking about, Otto, it actually is a Spanish word meaning land pirate, and the first person to earn that name was Francis Drake. So Francis Drake, when he was raiding the Spanish galleons and all, he actually became the first filibuster.
Isn't
So
that kind of ironic that this whole time we've been talking about Anglo colonial enterprises against the Spanish, and where does it originate with an Anglo raiding the Spanish?
yep, exactly. So as you said, it all goes back
It
to
all
tradition.
circles the past. It's kind of funny because during this whole thing, we started out with the talking about the Knights of the Golden Circle, and then we kind of went through their history, and then we circle back to the beginning of the first filibusters in America, all the way back again to the Knights of the Golden Circle. Um, I was about to say if you're fine with it, I was going to call it a wraps since we're over our 2 hour mark. Um, I'd like to continue this more. Maybe go on and talk about some of these things more in the future tense of the post Civil War era, Spanish American War. That's a very forgotten war. Nobody knows really much about the actual on the ground details. So if you want to, we can resume. We can resume another time here soon, and maybe get some of that done.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. I'd love to continue the discussion, and I would certainly love to get into what is the post Civil War era of expansion, as I mentioned earlier, and how the Southern cause for expansion is sort of redeemed. And so I'd love to talk about that and really shed light on the Spanish American
And I
War.
have my own theories to posit as well, because as we see, America doesn't really. If I would have to study more, but it's funny that we basically gained possession of Cuba, then more or less give it away to Cuba, like we lose it, but then the communist revolution happens there, and we try to get it back, and that fails.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It's a very unfortunate event. It's actually heartbreaking how that happened, and I'd love to really touch upon that as well. And well, yeah. I mean, it's been a pleasure, Otto. I really, I could talk about this until tomorrow. So
no, no,
yeah, I'm
you're
really
good. No,
happy
you're
about it.
good. No, you're good. It's just sometimes you sit on here with the headset on and all that. It's different. It's different when you have a good few angry orchards, and you're in real life sitting around. But when you're by yourself in a room with a headset on, your ears start to hurt. You got other things to do. It's not as fun as real life. And but yeah, do you want to give yourself a shout out maybe on Twitter or Substack or something where people can follow you, so they know who you are, so they can look into you.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I had a Twitter account going. Unfortunately, I deactivated it for personal reasons, and it just I forgot that after the 30-day mark, it would just permanently be erased, and so I have to get back on X. But I'm going to be on Twitter. Look out for or X as it's now known, thanks to our guy Elon. He's doing a great job, and I'm going to be known as William Walker, my hero, the gray-eyed man of destiny. So be looking out for that. And yeah, give me a follow, and I'd love to really continue to talk about this and more onto Latin American relations, more also about the Monroe Doctrine that had a lot to do with this as well, and the Spanish American War. There's just a lot to touch upon here, and I'm really looking forward to resuming the conversation.
Alrighty. Well, we'll have to continue with that. Hopefully another time, but hopefully soon. So as always, this is Otto. You can follow me on Twitter at Otto Hawker, or it's Otto Wolf Helmson, I think, more specifically. And with my Substack, it's Wolf Helmson Substack. Just follow me. It's the same as the previous YouTube videos I made with Peter Thistle. Always I'll give him a shout out even though he's not here with us. I'll give Peter Thistle at Perry This, shout out on Substack and on Twitter. But yes, I'm looking forward to this series. Looking forward to progressing in new eras, more further in the past, and more relevant to my even though I don't live really anywhere near the Golden Circle, um, it's more relevant to me because I am an American than a lot of things that this channel has been talking about, which is all right. We need to explore all areas of history, but it's a little refreshing to tackle something new and a new challenge as well. Um, but other than that, thank you for coming on, William Walker. We appreciate your time and your information. We hope to use you as a service again to teaching correct history on YouTube.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, anytime. I will certainly be back, and we have a lot to talk about. So y'all have a great night. Thank you for tuning in, and again, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on here, and good night, everybody. God bless, and y'all have a great weekend.
Thank you. Likewise.
Mhm.